There is something in a kitchen that most people barely notice, a loaf of bread on the counter, or wrapped in paper, or still warm from a bag. It has been there so long, in so many kitchens, in so many centuries, that it has become almost invisible. But bread is one of the oldest things people make, older than farming, older than the wheel. And the story of how it changed, slowly, across thousands of years, is also the story of how ordinary life got its shape. There is no rush, just settle in and listen. Most people know the smell of bread before it is done. Something warm and faintly yeasty, a little like toast but softer. The smell that fills a kitchen when the oven is doing its work and there is nothing required of you except to wait. It is one of the most recognizable smells in an ordinary life. You have known it so long that it barely registers as something you once had to learn. Bread is like that in general, so familiar it nearly disappears into the background. The weight of a loaf in one hand, not heavy, but solid in a particular way, denser than it looks from across the counter. The resistance when a thumb presses the crust and finds the give of the crumb just underneath. These are things most people have known since they were very small, and they go on knowing them without needing to pay attention. But bread is much older than the kitchens it lives in now, older than any permanent kitchen, older than the ovens, the milled flour, the recipes, the markets where flour is sold by the bag, older than farming. The story of bread begins in a time before any of the structures that would later be built around it, before the walls, the granaries, the guilds, the laws, in a time when the gesture of making bread was so simple and so direct that it barely looks, from this distance, like a recipe at all. Somewhere in what is now the Black Desert of Jordan, roughly 14,000 years ago, someone pressed a handful of ground wild grain against a hot stone beside a fire and waited. The landscape there today is dry and rocky, mostly treeless, a wide flat basin scattered with the dark basalt that gives the region its name. 14,000 years ago it was somewhat greener, somewhat more varied in its vegetation, but it was still not fertile ground in any agricultural sense. The people who lived there were not farmers, they were hunter-gatherers, part of a culture that spread across the Levant during that long era, mobile enough to follow the season's food, but settled enough at certain times of year to build stone structures and return to them. At a site called Shubaika 1, archaeologists found charred crumbs embedded in the stone structures of one of these settlements. Only careful laboratory analysis made those crumbs fully readable. What the researchers found inside them was a mixture of 3 ingredients: ground wild einkorn wheat, ground wild barley, and the crushed tuber of a water plant, a kind of club rush that grew near water sources in the region. These had been mixed together with water and cooked on a flat stone placed at the edge of a fire, or possibly directly in the embers. The bread that resulted would have been flat, dense, probably no thicker than 2 fingers at most. Not a loaf in any sense that word usually carries, nothing with a risen dome or a scored crust, or an open interior of holes and tunnels. Something simpler than that. A round of pressed grain dough, cooked through on one side and then the other. Something you could pick up in one hand and eat without needing anything else. Those crumbs are roughly 14,000 years old. They are the oldest confirmed bread in the archaeological record. What makes that date significant is not only the age, but what it says about the relationship between bread and everything that came after it. For a long time, the natural assumption was that bread followed from farming, that people first learned to plant wheat and harvest it reliably year after year, and only then, having grain in adequate supply, learned to grind it fine and bake it into something worth eating. The cultivation of wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent began roughly 10,000 years ago, so the sequence seemed obvious: agriculture first, then bread. But the crumbs at Shubarka 1 are 14,000 years old. That is 4,000 years before cultivated wheat. The people who baked that bread had no planted fields, no managed crops, no stored grain held against a bad harvest. They gathered their grain where it grew wild, in the stands of einkorn and barley that came up in season on the hillsides and margins of the landscape. They carried it back, ground it, and baked it. There is a well-considered thought, not a fringe idea, but one taken seriously by researchers in this area, that the desire to do this more reliably, to have enough grain close at hand every season, rather than depending on the scattered wild harvest, was one of the pressures that led people toward farming. Not the other way around. Farming may partly have followed from the desire to have enough grain to bake. Bread was not a product of the agricultural revolution. It may have helped cause it. That is a quiet reversal of the usual assumption. Once you know the dates, it simply sits there. The grain itself in that era was not sown or tended. It grew where conditions permitted and was gathered when it was ready. Wild einkorn is a slender grass, its seed head small and brittle, inclined to shatter when fully ripe, which meant the timing of the harvest mattered. Too late and the grain scattered, too early and it had not yet filled out. The people who gathered it would have known this from season to season, from watching and from doing it many times before. After gathering came grinding, and grinding grain was not a new idea even 14,000 years ago. Stone grinding tools have been found across a remarkable range of places, across the Levant and the broader Mediterranean region, into Central Europe, in parts of China and in Australia, where some of the oldest grinding stones found so far go back perhaps 30,000 years or more. For many thousands of years, people in many parts of the world had been pressing grain and seeds against flat stones to reduce them to something finer and more useful. The grinding stone did not belong to bread. Bread grew from the grinding stone. The basic tool was simple: a lower stone, flat or slightly concave, and an upper stone held in both hands and pushed back and forth across the grain spread between them. The grain cracked, fractured, and broke into smaller and smaller pieces as the work continued. What accumulated was a coarse powder, not white, not fine, full of bran and germ, that smelled of dust and something faintly sweet underneath. It is worth staying with the grinding for a moment, because this is where bread really begins. Not in the oven, not in the mixing, but in this very old and unhurried gesture of stone against grain. The upper stone had weight to it, enough weight to feel after any sustained period, enough that the wrists and forearms registered the effort of pushing it. You pressed down and pushed forward from the hips, then drew back, then pushed again. The grain underneath made a dry, rough sound at first. As the flour accumulated, the sound changed, becoming slightly softer, more whispered, as though the stone were moving over something finer. The flour that gathered at the edges of the lower stone was warm from the friction. If you pinched it between thumb and forefinger, it left a fine pale film on the skin, smelling of the grain it had come from. After enough had accumulated, you added water. Not much, just enough to bring the powder together into something that held its shape. The dough that resulted was stiff and rough, nothing like the smooth and elastic thing a modern wheat dough becomes. It had almost no give to it. You pressed it flat with your palms against a smooth stone until it was roughly even, maybe the thickness of 2 fingers, maybe less. Then it went onto the stone that had been sitting beside the fire long enough to hold a dry, steady heat. Not burning, just hot. The The smell that came first was the smell of something dry, beginning to toast. As the dough cooked through, the smell deepened. Something faintly nutty, something of the bran in the flour. At the edges, where the dough was thinnest and the heat most direct, the sharp edge of something beginning to scorch. That scorched edge was not unwelcome. It meant the bread was nearly done. What came off the stone would not have looked like much. Flat, dense, uneven across its surface, dark at the edges. The color somewhere between pale tan and medium brown. The crumb is almost too generous a word for something this dense and unleavened, compact and slightly chewy, with real resistance in it. But it was filling. Wild einkorn and wild barley are both rich in protein and carbohydrate, and the tuber flour added starch and a faint earthiness to the flavor. The finished bread was portable, easy to carry, easy to eat without preparation, something that could sustain a person through a long morning of walking or gathering, and it would keep for a day or two, which in a diet that included much food requiring immediate preparation was genuinely useful. The effort required to make it was real, gathering the grain in season, carrying it, drying it if it needed to be kept, grinding it before each use. None of this was simple. But the return was also real, and the tools required, a grinding stone and a fire, were already part of daily life, long before bread was baked on them. This is why bread, in its origins, feels less like a discovery than like a gradual recognition. People were grinding grain for a very long time. People were cooking things beside fires for a very long time. At some point, at many points, in many places, the two things came together, and the result was worth repeating, so it was done again, and adjusted slightly, and done again, across thousands of years. No one person woke up one morning and invented bread. It grew from the same gestures repeated, in the same order, until the combination became reliable, and the knowledge of how to do it lived in people's hands. Not knowledge that could easily be put into words. Knowledge that survived by being done. Patience is built into bread from the very beginning. Not the patience of waiting for a loaf to rise, that would come later. The patience of a practice refined through repetition rather than reasoning, through doing the same thing many times and learning from the small differences between one result and the next. This kind of knowledge is slow knowledge. It lives in hands. None of what would later surround bread was present yet. No purpose-built ovens, only open fires and heated stones. No leavening, no fermentation, no lightness in the crumb. No bakers in any professional sense. No one whose only work was bread. No one who baked for people other than those they lived with. No households organized specifically around the task. No rooms set aside for it. No dedicated tools beyond the grinding stone and the fire. No granaries, no stored grain held against the next season. No markets, no mills, no measures, no laws about the weight of a loaf or the price of flour. None of the structures that would eventually shape the world of bread had yet been built. The structures would come because the bread came first. Just grain gathered in season, water mixed in by hand, heat managed beside a fire, and a person in a rocky landscape, in what is now Jordan, with pale flour on their hands and a flat disk of bread just off the stone. Agriculture would come, the planted field, the managed landscape, the harvest gathered from cultivated rows rather than from wild stands. All of that would come. Ovens would come, built from clay, shaped specifically to hold and concentrate heat, designed with bread in mind. Cities would come with professional bakers and large mills and the social structures that formed around them. All of that was ahead. All of it grew eventually from the same beginning, a fire and a flat stone heated by that fire, and someone pressing a handful of ground grain against it and waiting for the smell to tell them it was done. That is enough for now. The next part of the story takes place in a valley, where a river floods and retreats on a schedule close enough to a calendar that you could plan your life around it, and where bread became, for the first time, a social arrangement as much as a domestic one. In the valley of the Nile, where the river flooded and receded on a rhythm you could almost set a calendar by, bread became the first currency many people would ever earn. The flooding of the Nile was not a catastrophe, it was a schedule. Every year in late summer the river rose and spread across the flat land on either side, and when it retreated, it left behind a fresh layer of dark silt, some of the most fertile soil in the ancient world. Grain planted in that silt grew quickly and reliably. Not wild grain gathered from scattered hillside stands, but cultivated emmer wheat, planted in rows, tended through the growing season, harvested at its peak and stored in quantities large enough to last through the dry months until the next flood brought the next renewal. The Egyptian farmer did not wait and hope for grain, they planned for it. The scale that planning made possible was different in kind from the scale of any gathered grain, and different scale meant different bread. The grain itself was not the same as modern wheat. Emmer, the wheat of ancient Egypt, kept its husk tightly wrapped around each kernel, which meant that before it could be ground, it had to be prepared. The husk had to be loosened by moistening the grain and pounding it, by hand or with a heavy stone pestle, before any milling could begin. This extra step added real labor to every baking cycle. It was built into the work of bread the same way grinding was, unavoidable, daily, physical. The grinding was done on the saddle quern. The name comes from the shape of the lower stone, which was longer than it was wide and slightly concave across its surface, something like the seat of a saddle. The upper stone was smaller, held in both hands, pushed back and forth over the grain spread on the lower surface. The motion was a rocking one, forward from the hips, pressing down and pushing away, then drawing back, then forward again. It was not elegant work, it was hard and slow, and required sustained effort for an amount of flour that by modern measure would seem barely sufficient for a single morning's baking. The people who worked the saddle quern for years left evidence of it in their bones. Skeletal analysis of ancient Egyptian remains shows patterns of stress concentrated in the knees, where the body braced against the forward push, in the lower spine, which bore the repeated forward lean, and in the shoulders, where the arms transmitted force down through the stone. These were not the marks of occasional effort. They were the marks of daily work, accumulated in the body, the way any sustained labor accumulates over years. There was another cost to the grinding, one that was not visible until long after the fact. The stone itself wore down slightly as it worked against the grain, and small particles of grit, fragments of millstone, entered the flour along with the ground wheat. Those particles ended up in every loaf, every flatbread, every portion of bread eaten in ancient Egypt, and they ended up in the teeth of the people who ate that bread. Analysis of ancient Egyptian skulls shows severe wear on the molar surfaces, more than the grain itself could account for, more than is found in populations that did not eat stone-ground bread daily. The grit worked against the enamel from the inside out, year after year. Grinding made bread. Bread wore down the people who ate it. This was the trade, unremarked upon, built into the daily reality of ordinary Egyptian life. The bread that came from all this preparation was baked in ovens, and the ovens changed over time. Not quickly, and not through any single innovation that replaced what came before, but in the slow manner of improvement that comes from generations of bakers working with the same tools and noticing, year by year, what could be done differently. In the Old Kingdom, the era that roughly corresponds to the age of the Great Pyramids, baking was done in heavy pottery molds. These were thick clay containers, shaped to the form of the finished bread, placed in the embers of a fire, and left to heat with the dough inside them. The clay conducted the heat slowly and evenly. The bread that came out was dense and shaped by the mold, rather than by any rise in the dough. It was reliable bread, filling bread, but not light bread. By the Middle Kingdom, some centuries later, the molds had changed. The new design was taller and more pointed, a conical clay pot, open at the top, set on a square hearth and heated from below. Bread baked in these cones rose slightly as it cooked, filling the interior and emerging with a form that narrowed at the base and broadened toward the top. The conical loaves appear in Egyptian tomb paintings and in the small clay models of granaries found in tombs, stacked in quantities that suggest they were made many at a time. The bread was still dense by any modern standard, but the shape showed that the bakers had begun to understand what heat could do to dough that had room to expand. The third generation of oven arrived in the New Kingdom, and it was a substantial change. The new design was large and cylindrical, an open-topped clay oven wide enough to hold many loaves at once, with walls thick enough to retain heat after the fire had burned down. The baker dampened the inner walls and slapped flattened rounds of dough against the hot clay, where they stuck and cooked against the surface in the same manner that bread is still baked in clay tandoor ovens in parts of the world today. The bread peeled away from the wall when it was done, carrying the slight char of contact with the clay. Each change in the oven made the bread a little lighter and the work a little more predictable. Not a revolution, a refinement spread across generations. Somewhere in this long history of Egyptian bread, leavening appeared. The exact origin cannot be pinned down because leavening in its earliest form was not an ingredient. It was a process, a natural one, which is to say it happened without being entirely planned. Wild yeast is everywhere, on grain, on flour, on the surface of a wooden mixing bowl, on the hands of a baker. When flour is mixed with water and left to rest for a period of time, wild yeast begins to feed on the sugars in the flour, producing gas as it does. The dough expands, becomes slightly sour, and when baked produces a bread with a lighter, more open crumb than unleavened dough would give. In Egypt, bread and beer were made from the same grain and made close together. The foamy liquid that rose to the surface of fermenting grain, the substance that later brewers and bakers would call balm, could be skimmed off and worked into a fresh dough. This transferred living yeast from the fermentation into the bread. The dough that resulted, given time to rest, would begin to rise. How well the baker understood the biology of what was happening is not easy to say. What is clear is that they understood it worked, and they kept doing it. It is worth noting gently what Egypt did and did not do. The oldest confirmed sourdough bread in the archaeological record is not Egyptian. It predates the great period of Egyptian bread-making by more than 1,000 years. Found at Neolithic lake-dwelling settlements in what is now Switzerland, dated to roughly 700 years before the Common Era. Leavening was not an Egyptian invention. What Egypt contributed to the story of bread was something different: scale, specialization, and for the first time in any record we have in detail, professional bakers, people whose only work was bread. The record of Egyptian bread has survived in an unusual form. The walls of ancient tombs were decorated with detailed paintings and reliefs of daily life, and daily life included bread. Tomb paintings show women grinding grain on saddle querns. They show the mixing of dough in large flat vessels. They show rows of loaves in different shapes: round loaves, oblong loaves, fan-shaped loaves, and small forms worked into the shapes of fish, animals, and human figures. Some of these may have been ceremonial, made for offering rather than eating. Most appear to be simply bread, the ordinary variety of shapes that a professional baker might produce in the course of a day. The most detailed image of organized bread making from the ancient world is carved into the walls of the tomb of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu in Upper Egypt. It shows a royal bakery in full operation, workers at separate stations, some grinding, some mixing, some shaping, move through a sequence that leads toward the ovens at the end of the scene. Different bread shapes are visible at different stages of completion. Multiple ovens are in use at once. The scale is not the domestic scale of a single household making its weekly bread. It is the scale of a professional operation supplying a large and demanding establishment. And the person whose knowledge kept those ovens running, whose hands shaped the dough, and whose judgment knew when the bread was done, that person was a baker. A professional working in a building built for his work, with tools kept for his use, making bread for people he would never sit down to eat with. Before coinage existed, before anything we would recognize as currency had yet been invented, wages in ancient Egypt were often paid in bread and beer. Administrative records that survive from pyramid construction sites give us the rations for the workers. Quantities of bread and beer, specified by grade and by the status of the recipient. Foremen received more than laborers. Skilled craftsmen received different grades from unskilled ones. What you were paid in bread was not simply sustenance, it was also a statement of where you stood. Being paid in bread was not a metaphor, it was the economic reality of most working lives. There was no alternative in which a worker might have been paid in coin and spent it as he chose. The bread was the wage, it was also the meal. It arrived each day, calculated against the labor given, distributed according to rank and role. This is the through-line moment in Egypt's contribution to the story of bread, not the oven design, not the variety of loaf shapes documented in the tombs. It is this, that bread in Egypt became the medium through which people were compensated for their work. It left the individual hearth and became a public fact. Something that passed between people who were not family, between the employer and the worker, between the state and the individual it employed. And once bread had become a social arrangement, it required someone to make it reliably. It required a baker, a professional with a name, a place, tools, and people whose lives depended on them showing up. Egypt gave the world, for the first time in any well-documented record, not just the loaf but the baker. The baker as a role, a specialization, a necessary part of how a community fed itself. And once the baker existed as a profession, the city that relied on that baker would have to think about how to organize itself around them. It would have to think about supply and storage and what happened when the grain did not come. Those questions would be answered, in time, by a city on the banks of a different river, a city that would come to consider bread not merely a daily staple, but something close to a public right. The next part of this story moves there, to a city on 7 hills, to a valley where granaries stood along the riverbanks, to a state that would eventually decide that the most important thing it could do for its citizens was make sure they were fed. In the Roman city, the smell of baking bread was never far from anywhere. By the 1st century of the Common Era, there were hundreds of bakeries in Rome alone, and the state had already decided that bread was too important to leave entirely to the market. Walk through any quarter of Rome before dawn, and the air would have carried the same thing in every direction. The warm, dense smell of bread already in the oven, the charcoal and clay smell of the great beehive ovens doing their work, before the streets had fully woken. Bread was not absent from Roman life. Bread was the constant underneath it. The thing that went on regardless of everything else, the work that had to be done before the city could begin its day. The professional baker in Rome arrived in the company of others. Around 168 BCE, a group of Greek bakers came to the city, bringing with them the techniques and practices of a bread-making tradition already well established in the Greek world. Before their arrival, Romans had eaten bread, flats, grain porridges, loaves baked at the household hearth, but professional bread-making, as a distinct and formally organized trade, was not yet an institution in the city. The Greek bakers changed that. Within a generation or two, the trade had organized itself into the city's first professional bakers' guild. The guild gave the trade structure, protected its members, and gradually took on a more official role in ensuring the city was supplied. Professional, guild-organized bread-making arrived as a distinct institution relatively late in Roman history, but once it arrived, it embedded itself quickly. What the Roman baker made was not one thing. The variety was considerable. There were simple round loaves for everyday eating, dense and filling. There were griddle cakes cooked flat on heated stone. There were loaves enriched with honey and olive oil, with a slightly sweet and yielding interior. There were mushroom-shaped rolls dusted with poppy seeds, their distinctive shape still visible in loaves preserved by the volcanic ash at Pompeii, exactly as they were when the ovens stopped. And there were harder, denser rolls made for soldiers on campaign, designed to last for days without crumbling. The hierarchy among these breads was organized primarily by the flour. At the top was bread made from twice-bolted fine white flour, sieved through the finest mesh to remove almost all of the bran, leaving behind something pale and relatively smooth. Below it came ordinary household bread, made from once-bolted flour, still relatively light, but with more of the grain in it. Below that were breads made from unbolted flour, the whole of the grain, ground without sieving, dark, dense, and considerably cheaper. What a person ate, and which grade they ate, said something about where they stood. The fineness of the flour was the fineness of the life. There is a Greek word, opson, that helps make sense of what bread meant in both the Greek and Roman worlds. Opson meant, roughly, the condiment, everything eaten with bread, the fish, the olives, the vegetables, the occasional meat. All of this was opson. The bread was not the accompaniment, the bread was the meal. Everything else on the table was there to make the bread more varied, more palatable, more worth eating. This arrangement, bread as primary, everything else as secondary, was not a poverty-defined relationship. Even in wealthy households, even at tables with a generous spread of opson, the bread remained the structural center of the meal. Everything else accompanied it. This had very practical implications for how the city thought about its food supply. If bread was the meal, then the supply of grain was not one item among many. It was the foundational item, the one without which nothing else worked. A city without enough grain was not merely a city with a gap in its diet. The large commercial bakeries of Rome, the pistrina, were not modest operations. The beehive-shaped ovens built into the bakeries of Pompeii, where the walls still stand, measured 3 to 5 meters across their base. Multiple ovens shared a single building, which might also contain water-driven mills that ground the grain into flour. Workers handled the dough, shaped the loaves, loaded and unloaded the ovens, and managed the fire. A working pistrinum was a hot, loud, and perpetually busy place. The watermill, developed in Rome in the 1st century BCE, shifted some of the most physically demanding work of bread-making away from human bodies. In Egypt, the saddle quern had placed the full effort of grinding onto the people who worked it. in their knees and spines and shoulders. In Rome, by the height of the empire, water power was doing much of that work instead. The grain still had to be managed, the flour still had to be sifted and weighed. The baker's work remained hard. It was simply a different kind of hard. The grain that fed Rome's bakeries came from a long way away. By the height of the empire, the city could not come close to feeding itself from the farms of Italy alone. Its population required an enormous and continuous flow of grain from the provinces. The main sources were Egypt, which sent its harvest down the Nile and across the Mediterranean in large cargo ships. North Africa, the fertile coastal lands of what is now Tunisia and Libya, and Sicily, which had been supplying grain to the Italian mainland for centuries before Rome's dominance. The ships that carried this grain were among the largest vessels in the ancient world, designed specifically for the bulk transport of food. When those ships were delayed, or when the harvest failed in one of the supplying regions, the effects in Rome were immediate and visible. Grain prices rose, bread became harder to obtain, the streets became noisier and more difficult to manage. The Roman government understood, early and clearly, that the supply of grain was a political matter as much as a logistical one. The grain dole, the cura annone, the care of the grain supply, began as something emergency and temporary, and became, over the course of centuries, one of the most characteristic institutions of the Roman state. In 123 BCE, the tribune Gaius Gracchus introduced a law making grain available to Roman citizens at a subsidized price, below the market rate, though not yet free. The law was contested, as such laws tend to be, but it survived. In 58 BCE, the tribune Clodius went further and made the grain distribution free entirely. The recipients numbered somewhere around 320 adult, male citizens of Rome, entitled by their citizenship to their share of the city's grain. The commitment deepened gradually from there. Emergency had become policy, policy had become permanent institution, and in the late 2nd century of the Common Era, the Emperor Septimius Severus made a change that completed the logic of the grain dole in a particular way. The dole until then had been distributed as grain, raw grain, which the recipient would take home, grind, and bake themselves, or carry to a mill and a bakery and pay for the processing. Septimius Severus changed the distribution from grain to baked bread. The state, going forward, would bake the bread and distribute it already finished. This is a small change in description, and a large change in what the state was doing. The difference between giving someone flour and giving someone a loaf is the difference between supplying a raw material and supplying a finished food. Before this change, the state supplied the grain. After it, the state supplied the bread. The grinding and the baking, the labor, the knowledge, the ovens, the fuel, had moved from the individual household to a state apparatus. Bread that arrived, ready to eat, rather than bread that had to be made. It is not a trivial distinction. The household that had previously organized part of its week around turning its grain ration into bread now received a loaf. The domestic task had been absorbed into something institutional. The city was now, in a very practical sense, baking for its citizens. By the 4th century, the infrastructure that supported this commitment was considerable. Rome had 254 state-regulated bakeries operating within the city, alongside 290 granaries for storage. The annual grain import was estimated at somewhere between 150,000 and 272,000 tons, a range that reflects the difficulty of working from ancient sources, but even at the lower end represents a logistical operation of considerable scale. The ships, the ports, the warehouses, the mills, the ovens, the bakers, all of this existed to maintain one thing. The satirist Juvenal writing in the early 2nd century, captured what bread had come to mean in Roman civic life, in a phrase that has been repeated ever since: panem et circenses, bread and circuses, what the Roman population demanded of its government, and what it had come to expect, was its bread and its public entertainments. Juvenal used the phrase as a criticism, a comment on what he saw as the political passivity of citizens who had traded their civic engagement for their rations. But the phrase also reveals the position bread had come to occupy. It had become so foundational to the idea of Roman citizenship that it could be named alongside public spectacle as one of the two things a Roman simply expected to receive: not a luxury, not a reward, a given. When the empire contracted and the great grain ships stopped running, and the administrative structures that had managed the supply of food across the Mediterranean began to fail, the cities that had grown up around that certainty began to shrink. A city that could not feed itself, could not maintain itself. The Rome of the 4th century, with its 254 bakeries and its reliable supply from 3 provinces, was not the same city as the Rome of the 6th century, smaller, quieter, living off what it could grow and store in the surrounding countryside. Bread returned to the household. The organized bakery, the professional baker, the state-regulated loaf, none of this vanished entirely, but it pulled back, became local, became domestic again. For much of what we call the medieval period, across much of Western Europe, the work of making bread came back inside. Back to the hearth, to the weekly rhythm of the household, to the hands of the people who would eat what they made. The next part of this story is set there, in a kitchen in medieval England, on a cold Tuesday morning, with a dough that has been rising since the night before. Sometime on a Tuesday morning in a medieval English village, someone's dough had been rising since the night before. By midday, it would need to be at the oven. The making of bread in a medieval household was not an event. It was a recurring obligation, as fixed in the week as anything else that had to be maintained on a schedule. Dough, once started, needed to be managed, kept warm enough to rise, shaped before the yeast had gone too far, baked at the right point before the window of good timing closed. The household that ate bread, which was every household, organized its week around the point in that week when the bread had to be made. And it was not every day. The weekly bake, or sometimes twice weekly, produced enough bread to last until the next one. This shaped how bread was eaten. Day-old bread was normal. 2-day-old bread was still good. The loaf was expected to age a little, and the household adjusted what it did with bread according to where in the week the loaf stood. The kitchen was the center of the medieval house. Not always a separate room. In modest dwellings, the hearth that warmed the house was also where the food was cooked, where water was heated, where dough was left to rise in the warmth beside the fire. The smell of a house where bread was regularly made was layered and particular, wood smoke always, the faint sourness of a dough left overnight, the dry flour and grain smell of the crock where the flour was stored. In wealthier households, with proper larders and separate baking facilities, the process was more elaborate, but the principle was the same. Dough made the evening before, left to rise through the night in a covered vessel near the fire, and in the morning ready to be shaped and moved toward heat. The timing was managed by feel and by practice, rather than by any instrument, by the texture of the dough under a probing thumb, by the look of the surface, by the experience of having done the same thing many times before. This knowledge lived in the person who did it. It was passed on by doing, not by instruction, the same way all the oldest bread knowledge had always been passed on. Not everyone in a medieval English village ate the same bread. What went on the table depended on what could be afforded, and on what grain grew well in the land around you. And these two things were not always entirely separate questions. At the top of the hierarchy was manchet, the finest white bread in English baking, made from twice-bolted flour, which meant the grain had been ground and then sieved twice through progressively finer mesh to remove almost all of the bran, leaving behind a flour so pale it was nearly white. Manchet was a round, hand-sized loaf, not much larger than a generous roll by modern measure. It was dense but fine-textured, and it was expensive to make because the twice-bolting process removed a significant portion of the flour from every bushel of grain. William Harrison, an English clergyman, writing in 1577, described the making of manchet with a precision that reveals exactly how much its yield mattered to the household economy. From 1 bushel of fine flour, he wrote, a baker would produce 40 cast of manchet, 40 loaves. Each loaf went into the oven weighing 8 ounces and came out weighing 6. 2 ounces lost to the heat evaporated from each loaf. Harrison noted this not as a complaint but as a practical fact. The weight of the loaf out of the oven was what the household counted on. Below manchet in the hierarchy came cheat bread, household bread, made from once-bolted flour, still relatively pale by the standards of the era, and the bread that the gentry and their well-fed servants would typically eat. Below cheat bread came maslin, made from a mixture of wheat and rye, the grain that grew reliably in the heavier and wetter soils where wheat was uncertain. And at the base of the hierarchy was rye bread, dark, dense, with a long-keeping quality the finer breads did not have, and a flavor distinctly its own. The hierarchy was not simply a matter of preference. It was the geography of the grain made edible. Where wheat grew well, wheat bread was available to those who could afford the flour. Where wheat grew poorly and rye grew well, rye bread was the bread of ordinary life, not because it was inferior, but because it was what the land produced. A loaf of rye bread baked in northern England, or in much of Germany or Scandinavia, was bread suited to its climate, its soil, and the people who had grown up eating it. Rye bread kept longer than wheat bread, which mattered in households that baked weekly and needed the loaf to last through several days. It traveled well. In a winter kitchen with few of the other foods that summer provided, a dense rye loaf was not a compromise. It was sustenance, plain and reliable. The trencher was a less obvious but very practical part of the medieval table, and it deserves a moment of attention. A trencher was a plate made of bread, not a fresh piece of bread, not a delicate thing, a thick, flat, round cut from the bottom of a stale loaf, usually a day or two old, dense enough to hold its shape under a serving of meat or stew without immediately absorbing everything placed on it. The word came from the Old French for cutting. The trencher was cut from the loaf, shaped to purpose, and set before the diner, where a wooden plate would appear in later centuries. Through the meal, the trencher absorbed everything the food gave up: the juices of the meat, the liquid of the stew, the salt and fat of whatever sat on top of it. By the end of the meal, the trencher was thoroughly saturated, and this was the moment when its second life began. In many households, sauce-soaked trenchers were collected after the meal and distributed to servants who had not eaten the meal themselves, or to the poor at the door, or in some households to animals. Nothing was wasted. The bread that had served first as plate served afterward as food for someone who had not yet eaten. Wooden trenchers began to replace bread ones in well-off households from around the 15th century, as the supply of good milled flour made it less efficient to sacrifice a piece of stale loaf to the function of a plate. But even as wooden and later pewter plates became more common, the trencher's logic persisted. In a household that baked its own bread, nothing had only one use. Many households in a medieval English village did not have a large oven of their own. A hearth fire could bake bread if the need was pressing, tucked into the embers, or under a clay cover placed in the coals, but it was not the most reliable method, and it was not how weekly bread was typically made. The reliable oven was the communal one, the bakehouse belonging to the parish or to the lord of the manor, heated on fixed days of the week and available to the households that brought their dough to be baked there. This arrangement made the making of bread into something social. Dough was shaped at home, marked with a distinctive notch or stamp, so it could be identified among the other household's bread inside the communal oven and carried to the bakehouse. Neighbors arrived at roughly the same hour, waited for the oven to reach heat, loaded their bread alongside the bread of everyone else, and waited again. Then they carried the finished loaves home. The mark on the loaf was important. An unmarked loaf in a communal oven could not easily be claimed. Custom and local arrangement governed who went first, how long the oven could hold one household's bread before the next needed the space, what was done when the heat ran uneven. These were the small negotiations that formed around any shared resource, and they were part of the texture of village life in a way that the private hearth, for all its warmth, was not. The sensory life of the medieval kitchen on a baking day was particular and unmistakable. Wood-fired ovens produced a heat that was not consistent, but was in its inconsistency expressive, hotter near the back, cooler near the door, varying through the baking time as the stored heat in the clay worked its way through the loaves. The bread that came out carried the marks of this variability. The bottom of the loaf, closest to the stone floor of the oven, was almost always darker than the top, sometimes charred at the very edge, blackened in patches where the dough had touched the stone most directly. This was not a mistake. It was how the bread was, and the household that ate it had grown up with that charred bottom. The crust of a loaf made from coarse rye flour had a particular texture, thick, substantial, not easily torn. The crumb inside was dense and slightly moist, darker than wheat bread, with a faint sourness that deepened over the days the loaf sat. A rye loaf 2 days out of the oven was not the same bread as it had been the day it was made. It was firmer, the crumb tighter, the flavor more developed. In some respects it was better bread, more suited to the thick slice and the simple meal. The weight of a rye loaf held in both hands was part of how it was known, more than it looked, more than a wheat loaf of the same size. You held it the way you hold something you intend to eat for 3 days. There is a quiet observation worth settling with here, before this chapter moves on. Bread in the medieval household was not background to the meal. It was the meal. Everything else that appeared at a medieval table, the broth made from bones and onion, the saltfish kept through winter, the dried peas, the root vegetables in season, was there to make the bread more sustaining, more varied, more worth eating. The Romans had understood this and had the word for it. The medieval household had not forgotten the arrangement, even without the word. This is the through line of bread's long history, visible in the medieval kitchen as clearly as in any other era. Bread was not a side dish. It was the thing around which everything else organized itself. The week bent around the baking day. The table was set around the loaf. The meal, in the deepest sense of the word, was bread, and everything else that shared the table with it was company. Bread had structured time and rank and the table itself. It had defined what a week looked like and what a meal was and who ate which quality of loaf and why. And because it was so central, because so many people depended on it, because so much of ordinary life was organized around it, bread had attracted, inevitably, the attention of people who wanted to make sure it stayed honest. The next part of this story follows that attention to the first food law in British history and to the system of people whose work it was to make sure that the bread on the market stall weighed what it was supposed to weigh. In the autumn of 1266, a law was passed in England that tried to do something very simple. It tried to make sure that what a poor person could afford to buy would still be enough to eat. The law was called the Assize of bread and ale. It was not the first legal arrangement that had ever touched on bread. Manorial custom and guild practice had been shaping the trade in various unwritten ways for generations before it. But the Assize was the first systematic and sustained attempt in British legal history to regulate the production and sale of bread through a single enforceable instrument. It would be amended, reissued, and applied in various local forms for nearly 6 centuries after the day it was passed. The Parliament that passed it has been replaced many times over. The Assize of bread outlasted it. What the Assize did was this. It fixed the price of a penny loaf, and then varied the weight of that loaf according to the current market price of grain. When wheat was cheap and the harvest had been generous, the penny bought a loaf that was large, generous in its weight, and in what it could sustain. When wheat was scarce, and the price had risen after a poor harvest, the same penny still bought a loaf. But that loaf was smaller, the price stayed fixed. The bread grew or shrank with what the harvest had decided to do. The mechanism did not require any complicated understanding of economics. It was designed for a market stall, not a counting house, and its simplicity was the point. A sliding scale, periodically adjusted to reflect the current price of grain, told every baker operating within its jurisdiction what weight their penny loaf had to reach. When the grain price changed, the scale changed, and the loaves changed with it. An official checking compliance needed only a pair of scales and knowledge of the current index. The arithmetic was minimal. The principle was clear. What this gave to the poorest buyers was not cheap bread. The Assize was not a price control, in the sense of making bread inexpensive. It could not reduce the cost of grain when the harvest had been poor, and it made no attempt to do so. In a bad year, grain cost more, and the penny loaf shrank accordingly. That was the arrangement, and it was understood on both sides of every market transaction in which it applied. No one was pretending that the Assize made bread plentiful when it was not. What the Assize gave was reliability, the certainty that a penny would always buy a loaf, that the loaf would always represent a certain weight, a weight calibrated to what a working person needed to get through a day, that the connection between what a person could afford to pay and what they would receive in exchange was intact, and legally so, regardless of what the harvest had decided to do to the price of grain. For households at the margin, and medieval England contained a great many households at the margin, this was the difference that mattered most. Not the cheapness of the loaf in a good year, but the knowledge that in a bad year it would not simply disappear from reach. The loaf might be smaller, it would be there. Enforcement was local, because governance in 13th century England was local, and the Assize reflected that reality in its structure. In rural areas, the lord of the manor held the authority to weigh bread sold within his jurisdiction, to fine bakers who sold short weight, and to keep a portion of those fines as the fee for the service of enforcement. The arrangement was not purely altruistic. The lord had an incentive to enforce, because enforcement paid. But the practical effect, when it worked, was that bakers in rural areas operated under the knowledge that their loaves were not exempt from scrutiny. A visit from a manorial official with a set of weights was not a theoretical possibility. It happened. In towns, enforcement fell to guild officials and to the town authorities who had the organizational structure to apply it systematically. The guild, the organized body of the baker's trade, had both the interest and the capacity to monitor compliance among its members. A guild bakery that sold short-weight bread was not merely a dishonest business. It was a bakery undermining the reputation of the trade that every other guild member depended on. The guild had reasons of its own to make the standards stick. What this created was a persistent awareness among bakers, not anxiety, for a careful and honest baker had nothing to fear from a weighing, but awareness. The oven was not a private space sealed from accountability. It was a regulated workshop, producing a product whose weight was, in principle, a public matter, and one that could be checked at any time. The consequences for short-weight bread were calibrated to serve two different purposes at once. They punished the offending baker, and they performed that punishment publicly, so that everyone who saw it understood that the law was real. A first offense might result in a fine, a material penalty extracted from the baker's profit. For a second offense, or one egregious enough that a fine seemed insufficient, the authorities moved into the territory of public theatre. The most well-documented punishment was the hurdle procession. The baker was placed on a hurdle, a flat wooden sled of the kind used to drag heavy loads through streets, and pulled through the town from the bakehouse to the market and along the main public routes, with the offending short-weight loaf tied around their neck. The procession moved through the parts of the town where people were. The baker arrived back at their door, having been seen by most of the population. The purpose was not only to humiliate a single person, it was to communicate something about the system to everyone who watched. A crowd observing a baker pulled through the street with a light loaf around their neck was watching the social contract being enforced in visible form. The message was direct. The law existed, the law was applied, and the person who violated it paid in public currency as well as in coin. In the most serious and sustained cases of non-compliance, the penalties moved beyond fines and humiliation. Baking equipment could be destroyed, removing the capacity to offend. The right to operate as a baker could be revoked entirely. The guild could withdraw from a member what the guild had granted, and without guild membership, practice within a regulated town was not possible. The structure that gave the baker their livelihood was the same structure that held them to the standard. Among the practices that grew up in this climate of weight-keeping and accountability, the baker's dozen is perhaps the most familiar survivor. The story most commonly told about it runs like this. A baker found delivering short weight faced real and serious penalties under the Assize and Guild regulations. A careful baker, selling a dozen loaves to a customer or to a retail middleman, would add a 13th loaf to the order. This 13th loaf, the vantage loaf, as the trade called it, ensured that the total weight of the transaction met the legal minimum, even if any individual loaf was slightly lighter than it should have been. The extra loaf was a margin of safety built into the sale. The arithmetic of 13 allowed for a generous compliance that 12 alone might not. The Oxford English Dictionary notes a second explanation alongside this one. When a baker sold bread wholesale to a middleman who would then retail it to the public, the 13th loaf was the middleman's discount, a built-in margin that made the wholesale price viable for resale. Where the first explanation concerns legal protection against undescribed individual loaf weight, this one concerns the economics of the wholesale trade. One story is about fear of enforcement. The other is about commercial practice. Both are documented in sources from the relevant era. Neither story can be confirmed as the original. The surviving record does not resolve the question cleanly, and it may not need to. Both explanations are grounded in the reality of how bread was made and sold under the Assize and the guild system. Both describe a practical response to real conditions. The phrase settled into the language carrying both possibilities inside it. The way most things carry their history when they have been used long enough for the original reasons to blur. The guild itself deserves a moment of attention because it was the institutional form of something that would otherwise have been very difficult to maintain. The organized memory of how bread should be made was not, in any single baker, secure against time. A skilled baker died, retired, lost their ability to work. Their knowledge of proportions and heat and timing, built through years of practice, was knowledge held in that particular person and not guaranteed to outlast them. The guild was the structure that held the trade's knowledge beyond any individual's span. It did this through the apprenticeship system, a training arrangement in which a new entrant to the trade worked alongside a master baker for a period of years, absorbing not only the physical techniques of the work, but the standards and expectations that made the finished bread what it was supposed to be. An apprentice who completed their years and qualified as a journeyman baker emerged not merely as someone who could produce a loaf, but as someone who had been inducted into a tradition with standards attached. The customer who bought from a guild baker was buying into that tradition. The bread they received existed within a framework of expectation that was not merely personal to the individual behind the counter. It was institutional, in the small and local sense in which institutions function in ordinary life. The guild was not infallible. Guilds protected the interests of their existing members as well as the interests of their customers, and these two sometimes ran apart. There were documented cases of guild officials looking past violations in exchange for other considerations. The structure that was meant to ensure quality sometimes served, with equal efficiency, to protect established bakers from new competition. These were real failures, and they recurred across the history of guild regulation in England and elsewhere. But the structure also held something real: continuity of standard across generations in a trade that had no other mechanism for passing its knowledge forward with any consistency. The Assize of bread, in various amended forms, survived for very nearly 6 centuries. Glasgow abandoned its local application in 1801. London did not follow until 1815. By 1836, the local assizes had largely fallen out of active use across England, though the legal framework remained. The formal repeal in England and Wales came in 1863. From 1266 to 1863, 597 years. The law outlasted the guild system it had initially worked alongside. It outlasted several different forms of English government. It outlasted the medieval economy that had made its original form necessary. No single institution in the history of British bread did more, for a longer period, to protect the position of the ordinary buyer. Not perfectly, enforcement depended on the will of local officials, and that will varied enormously across different places and different eras. There were towns and periods in which the assize was vigorously applied, and others in which it sat on the books as a formal requirement that no one had the inclination to enforce. The framework was available for 6 centuries. What was done with it, in any particular place and time, depended on the people who were supposed to be doing it. But the framework was there, and its longevity is worth sitting with for a moment. In the same era that the Assize was being passed, the houses of a medieval English village were made of wood and daub. The roads were unpaved. The church was the primary institution of organized life, and the printing press had not yet been invented. By the time the Assize was repealed, the railway was changing the movement of goods across the country. The factory had remade the economy of manufacturing, and the city had grown into something the 13th century could not have imagined. Through all of it, the law about the weight of a loaf kept going. What the Assize had insisted on, across those 6 centuries, was something that seems obvious and is not. It insisted that the person who could afford only a penny for bread should receive, for that penny, bread enough to eat. The law could not make grain cheap. It could not prevent the harvest from failing. It could not alter the fundamental position of the person who had only a penny to spend, or improve the circumstances of a household living at the edge of what they could afford. It made no attempt to do any of those things. What it could do, what it spent 6 centuries doing, was hold the relationship between money and bread steady across whatever the harvest and the market decided to do. The loaf might shrink in a bad year. It would not disappear. The social contract embedded in that loaf was simple and serious. You would receive what you paid for. The law would try to hold that promise together, even when the interest of the individual baker pointed in a different direction. The Assize had regulated the weight of a loaf. For nearly 600 years, that had been the thing that required protecting. The quantity of bread in the transaction, the connection between a coin and enough to eat. But as bread moved further from the household, further from the village bakehouse where the neighbors knew each other's bread, from the small market town where the official with the scales appeared on market day, what was inside the loaf became harder to see. The weight could be measured on a pair of scales. The contents were another matter entirely. By the early 19th century, in the great industrial cities, a different kind of question had begun to form around the bread on the counter. Not whether it was heavy enough, but whether it was what it claimed to be. Move now toward the city, and toward a chemist named Acume, who spent several years taking the answer apart. By the early 19th century, in a large English city, most people no longer baked their own bread. They bought it from the bakeries that had spread through every quarter of every growing city, from counters where the loaves were white and uniformly shaped and available early in the morning, before the working day began. The domestic bake had left the household by degrees, quietly, following the fuel and the time that a city economy claimed for other purposes. The hearth remained. The bread came from somewhere else. The change had not announced itself. It had accumulated across the long arc of the 18th century and into the 19th. As the cities grew faster than any city had grown before, and the old arrangements of domestic life quietly rearranged themselves around new pressures. The hearth that had once been the center of cooking, warmth and baking did not disappear, but the functions gathered around it shifted, one by one, not because anyone decided the hearth was inadequate, but because alternatives became available, and, often enough, cheaper than doing the work at home. Fuel was one of the pressures. In a city household, the coal to heat a baking oven was an expense that appeared in the weekly accounts. The large clay oven of a medieval farmhouse had been heated with wood drawn from the land around it. Not free, but drawn from a resource that most rural households had some access to at some cost in labor. In a city there was no land and no wood. Everything came from the market and cost what the market asked. The time required to manage a domestic bake, the preparation of the dough the evening before, the monitoring of heat, the shaping, the loading and unloading, was time that could not be spent on the paid work that a city economy required of both adults in a household that needed 2 incomes to stay solvent. The commercial bakery offered something the domestic hearth increasingly could not match in cost or convenience. Their ovens were large and efficient, heated continuously by operations that justified the fuel. Their flour was bought in bulk at prices the individual household could not approach. Their bread was regular, consistent, available early in the morning when a household needed it, and for many city families genuinely cheaper than the equivalent made at home, once fuel and time were properly counted. And their bread was often white. This was not a small thing, the whiteness. White bread, bread made from flour that had been well bolted to remove most of the bran, had been a luxury for most of the English population throughout most of English history. The fine pale manchet of the Tudor kitchen was bread the gentry ate. The household bread of ordinary working people was once bolted at best, and more often mixed grain, rye heavy, dense and dark. Not bad bread, keeping bread, sustaining bread, but not white, and not associated with the comfortable end of the food hierarchy. White bread said something about the table it appeared on. By the early 19th century, the commercial bakery could produce white bread cheaply enough to sell it to people who had never been able to afford before. The price of white flour had come down. The mills were larger and more efficient. The grain supply was broader than it had been, and the range of wheats available for milling had expanded. What had been a marker of visible prosperity within recent memory was now available for pennies in any city bakery. Working families in industrial cities were eating white bread, or something that was sold to them as white bread. The qualification is important. The problem lay in the flour and in what certain bakers were adding to it before the loaf went into the oven. Adulteration of food was nothing new in the 19th century. Brewers had stretched their beer with cheaper ingredients for as long as beer had been brewed commercially. Spice merchants had cut expensive spices with cheaper substitutes whenever the margin made it worthwhile. Milk and butter had their own established histories of adulteration. But bread was different in its scale from most other foods, because bread was what most people ate most of the time. The adulteration of bread was not a niche problem affecting a small corner of someone's diet. It affected the main thing. It affected the thing that most working families in an English city depended on to carry them through each day. The most significant adulterant was alum, aluminium potassium sulfate, a white crystalline compound used industrially in dyeing and tanning. In baking, alum did several useful things for a baker who was starting with inferior flour. It whitened the loaf, masking the grey or yellowish cast of poor quality grain. It held moisture in the finished bread, which added weight without adding flour. The loaf felt more substantial than it was, and it weighed more. It also changed the texture of the crumb, producing a slightly more cohesive interior that suggested a better flour than was actually present. A loaf made with alum looked like better bread than it was, cost less to produce than good bread, and sold for the price of good bread. The profit was in the gap. Other adulterants appeared in different parts of the supply at different times. Chalk was used to whiten flour and add mass. Potato flour and other starches extended the bulk. The bread sat on the counter, white and appropriately heavy, at a price that seemed right. It was not entirely bread. In 1820, a German-born chemist working in London under the English form of his name, Frederick Accum, published a book. Its full title was a treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons, exhibiting the fraudulent sophistications of bread, beer, wine, spirituous liquors, tea, coffee, cream, confectionery, vinegar, mustard, pepper, cheese, olive oil, pickles, and other articles employed in domestic economy. The title alone made clear that the problem was not confined to one item on the table. What Hume had done, over the years the book represented, was methodical. He had obtained samples of food from the markets and the shops of London. He had tested them with the analytical chemistry available to him. He had documented what he found, and he had named names, specific suppliers alongside specific adulterants, not as an abstract warning about the food supply in general, but as an accusation with evidence behind it. The book caused considerable disturbance in the trades it implicated. Hume left England not long after its publication, partly on account of an unrelated legal difficulty, but the text remained and could not be retracted. What he had done was give the problem both a name and a face. He had made it possible for a reader, an ordinary buyer of bread in any city market, to look at the loaf on the counter and understand that the whiteness might not be the whiteness of good flour, and that the weight of the loaf might not reflect what a loaf of honest flour actually weighed. The gap between what was sold and what it appeared to be had been documented systematically for the first time. There is a comparison worth making here between what Hume found in the 19th century and what the Assize had spent 6 centuries doing. The Assize had regulated the weight of bread. For most of the period it covered, weight was the thing that required and permitted checking. A pair of scales, a set of standard weights, an official willing to use them. This was the technology of enforcement, and it was adequate to the problem the Assize was designed to address. The Assize assumed the bread enough of it. It only asked whether there was enough of it. What Hume revealed was a different kind of breach entirely, not shortage but substitution. The loaf was heavy enough. In fact, the alum had ensured that it was heavier than it should have been relative to the flour it contained. The loaf was white. The loaf was priced at what bread cost. The loaf was not quite bread. The social contract that the Assize had spent 6 centuries attempting to hold together had developed a crack that no set of scales could detect. The breach was not in the quantity. The breach was in the thing itself. The same principle that the person who paid for bread should receive bread now needed a different mechanism to enforce it. The scales were not enough. The legislative response came in stages, and each stage deepened the commitment. The Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860 established the framework of public analysts, chemists appointed by local authorities to test food samples and report their findings to the authorities that employed them. For the first time, the testing that Hume had done privately and published as an exposé became an official function of local government, embedded in legislation and funded from public money. A buyer who suspected adulteration could, in principle, request a test. A local authority that wanted to check the bread in its markets had a legal basis and a funded mechanism for doing so. The 1860 Act was imperfect, and everyone who worked with it knew it. The appointment of analysts was not mandatory, and many local authorities were slow to act. The penalties were modest. The provisions for enforcement were thinner than the principle the Act was meant to serve. Over the following decades, the legislation tightened through a sequence of amendments and successor acts, culminating in the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 and then in the further revisions of 1899. Each iteration strengthened the analyst system, increased the penalties, and narrowed the definitions of what could legally be sold as food. The principle these acts established was the same principle the Assize had articulated in 1266, applied now to a problem the 13th century had not had to consider. The Assize regulated quantity. These acts began to regulate content. Together, across 6 centuries and more, they formed the accumulating legal answer to a very old and very simple question. How do you make sure that what is sold as bread is honest bread? While the food laws were tightening around the content of the loaf, other changes were reshaping the supply of grain itself and the economics of flour. The corn laws, the import tariffs on grain that had protected English farmers from foreign competition since 1815, were repealed in 1846 after years of political argument about who bore the real cost of expensive bread. The argument was not simple. The farmers who grew British wheat had interests in the tariffs, and so did the landowners whose rents depended on what the farms could return. The mill workers and factory hands and city labourers, who spent a large portion of their wages on bread, had interests in the opposite direction. The repeal, when it came, reflected the shifting weight of those interests as the industrial economy outgrew the agricultural one. Cheaper grain from North America and elsewhere could now enter the British market without penalty. The price of flour fell. All cereal duties were abolished by 1869, completing the opening. Cheaper imported wheat, combined with the large roller mills that were replacing the older stone mills across Britain from the 1870s onward, made white flour available at prices that were genuinely low by any historical standard. The bread available to the poorest households in a British city by the 1880s would have been recognizable as reasonably good quality to any earlier era, provided, now, that the adulteration laws were doing their work. The loaf on the shelf was still a round loaf, or an oblong one, uncut, wrapped or unwrapped depending on the bakery, requiring a knife to serve. A household cutting bread for breakfast still cut it themselves at the kitchen table by hand. That too would change, and the change came from an unexpected direction. Otto Rovedder was an Iowa jeweler and engineer who had been working on a bread slicing machine since around 1912. The idea was straightforward in principle, a machine that cut a loaf into even slices mechanically, removing the effort and inconsistency of doing it by hand. The engineering was less straightforward. An early prototype was destroyed in a fire in 1917, and the work resumed after the war. By 1928, Rovedder had completed a machine that sliced and wrapped the loaf in a single operation. The combined slicer and wrapper, installed at the Chillicothe Baking Company in Chillicothe, Missouri, in July of that year. The phrase, "the best thing since sliced bread," entered the language within a few years, and has stayed there for nearly a century. It is an interesting kind of compliment, built on the assumption that the person hearing it knows what sliced bread is, and understands why it mattered. For a household in which bread was cut every morning at the table before the day began, having it arrive already sliced was a small and genuine convenience, not a transformation of the meal. Just one less thing to do before breakfast. The convenience was real enough that it was worth coining a phrase for, and real enough that the phrase has lasted. The bread on the counter was now bought, wrapped, and sliced. It had risen in a bakery whose oven rooms most of the people who ate it would never see. It had come from grain grown on a different continent, milled at a large mill many miles away, delivered to the bakery in flour sacks on the back of a lorry. From grain to shelf, the loaf had crossed distances and passed through processes that, in any previous era, would have been incomprehensible to the person lifting it from the basket. And what made it rise? The leavening that gave it lightness, that produced the open crumb and the dome and the breath in the interior of a good loaf, had also, over this same long century, been quietly and thoroughly transformed. The wild cultures that had leavened bread for 10,000 years were still alive in certain kitchens and certain traditions. But for most of the bread, in most of the shops, something different was at work now, something understood by science rather than by practice. standardized and packaged and delivered as reliably as the flour itself. The next part of this story follows that transformation, from the cultures no one fully understood to the small paper packet in a modern kitchen cupboard. For most of human history, bread rose because of something alive. Wild yeast drifting in from the air, a piece of old dough kept back from the last batch and worked into the new one, the foamy surface of a fermenting vessel in the brewery next door. Nobody knew, in any precise sense, what that something was. They knew how to keep it going, which is a different kind of knowledge, practical, held in the hands and in the schedule of the week, not dependent on understanding the mechanism behind it. A sourdough starter is a simple thing to describe. Flour and water mixed together and left at a warm temperature, then fed again with fresh flour and water at regular intervals. What builds in the mixture is a population of living organisms, wild yeast and bacteria, primarily lactic acid bacteria, thriving in the wet paste and producing as they eat. The yeast produces carbon dioxide gas, which is what causes dough to rise. Trapped in the gluten network of the flour, the gas inflates the dough from the inside, creating the open interior that distinguishes a leavened loaf from a flat one. The bacteria produce acids, lactic acid primarily, and smaller amounts of acetic acid, which are what gives sourdough bread its characteristic, slightly sour flavor and its longer keeping quality. The two populations work in something like tandem, each creating conditions the other can use. How a baker maintained a starter was a matter of habit settled into the week. Feed it regularly, add fresh flour and water to give the culture something to work on. Keep it warm, particularly in cold weather, because the organisms slow in the cold and can die if the temperature drops too far for too long. Use a portion of it to leaven the day's bread, return a portion to the crock, add the fresh feed, and set it back in its warm corner. The culture sitting in the crock at the end of the week was, in the meaningful sense, the same culture that had been there at the beginning of the previous week and the week before that. It was not remade from the start each time. It was maintained the way a fire is maintained, by tending it rather than replacing it, by not letting it go out. A starter that had been maintained over years developed a character shaped by the particular grain, the particular water, and the particular air of the place where it was kept. Two starters begun at the same time in the same kitchen, fed on the same flour, would diverge gradually if one was moved to a different house or a different region. The wild yeast and bacteria that populated each one were drawn from the local environment, and local environments differed. The bread a baker made from their own culture was, in some small but real way, bread from a specific place, shaped by invisible life that had been shaped by that place over time. The sourdough was not the only source of leavening available to a baker working near a brewery. Barm is the word for the thick foam that rises to the surface of ale during active fermentation, the head produced when the fermenting yeast rises in the vessel and carries gas with it. Skimmed off a fermenting barrel, barm could be worked directly into a bread dough, transferring living, active yeast into the mixture. The bread that resulted was leavened differently from sourdough. The ale yeast produced a different flavor profile, cleaner, less sour, lighter in character than the complex fermentation of a long-held sourdough culture. In a town that had breweries, barm was available as a routine matter. The baker did not need to maintain a separate culture. The brewery was the culture. For centuries, in much of England and across the ale-brewing regions of Northern Europe, barm was how bread was leavened, at least in the bakeries and households that had access to it. The relationship between baker and brewer was practical and close. The brewery produced a byproduct the baker needed. The baker took it off the brewer's hands. Bread and beer had shared their yeast, in one form or another, since long before anyone knew what yeast was. In 1846, that relationship was interrupted by a change on the other side of the fermentation vessel. Brewers across Europe were moving, through the middle decades of the 19th century, from the top fermenting yeasts that produced ale to the bottom fermenting yeasts that produced the pale lager beers that were overtaking ale in urban markets from Vienna to Paris to London. The practical difference, for bakers, was significant. Bottom fermenting lager yeast works at lower temperatures and stays at the bottom of the vessel rather than rising to the surface. It does not produce the balm that ale fermentation produces. In cities where brewers made the change, and they made it quickly, following the commercial demand for lager, the supply of balm that bakers had been using became scarce almost without warning. Austrian bakers, particularly in Vienna, responded by developing an alternative from the new lager yeast now available in greater quantities. Working with concentrated preparations of this yeast, they found ways to press and dry it into a form that could be added directly to bread dough, a pressed yeast cake that transferred living. Active leavening directly into the mixture without the intermediate step of balm. The bread this produced was lighter and more uniform than balm-leavened bread had been, with a more delicate crumb and a more consistent rise. The Kaiser Semmel, the Viennese roll with its characteristic five-pointed scored surface, is associated with the refinements of this method. The Vienna process, as it came to be called, spread across European commercial bakeries over the following decades, carrying the pressed yeast cake with it. One dependence had been replaced by another. The balm was gone, the pressed yeast was there instead. The understanding of why any of this worked, why wild cultures caused dough to rise, why balm transferred that property, why a pressed yeast cake could replicate it, came from Paris in the second half of the 19th century. Louis Pasteur had been working on fermentation for several years when in 1857 he published the first of the papers that would establish the fundamental nature of the process. Fermentation, Pasteur demonstrated, was not a chemical reaction in the way that had been assumed, not the spontaneous breakdown of sugars into alcohol and gas by some property of the liquid itself. It was a biological process driven by living microorganisms. The yeast was not incidental to the fermentation. The yeast was the agent of it. It was alive. It was eating the sugars in the liquid, and the alcohol and gas were what it produced as it did so. Pasteur continued to develop and extend this understanding through the 1860s and into the early 1870s. By the time his work on fermentation was substantially complete, it had become possible, not just for chemists in laboratory, but for the brewing and baking industries, to understand the distinction between different strains of yeast at a practical level. If you knew which strain of yeast produced which result, and if you could cultivate that strain in controlled conditions, you could produce it reliably and in consistent quantities. What had been knowledge maintained by practice, kept alive in the sourdough crock or the balm bucket because it worked, without any understanding of why, had become knowledge that could be managed by science. By 1879, commercial cultivation of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, baker's yeast, was established in Britain. The compressed yeast cakes that bakers began to use through the last decades of the 19th century were industrial products, grown in controlled fermentation vessels, standardized and in their behavior from one batch to the next, packaged and distributed through commercial networks. They required refrigeration to stay active for any useful length of time, but they were available from suppliers, and they worked predictably. This was a different kind of leavening from the sourdough culture that had sat in its crock for perhaps 20 years, fed with flour and kept warm through winter. The commercial yeast was not a living community shaped by its particular place and history. It was a standardized product, identical in its behavior regardless of where it was used or who used it. The loaf it produced was consistent in the way that only a standardized input can make a product consistent. The bread you bought on a Tuesday was, in a real sense, the same bread you bought on a Friday, made by a different baker in a different bakery, with the same yeast and the same reliable behavior. Standardization had advantages. It made bread more predictable, more uniform, and easier to produce at scale. What it did not produce, could not produce, was the slow biological transformation of a long fermentation, the complex flavor compounds, the particular acids, the character that developed in dough over hours rather than minutes. The Second World War moved the development of commercial yeast in a direction that would eventually change the home kitchen. Fleischmann's Yeast, an American company that had been producing compressed yeast since the 1870s, was contracted to supply the United States military with a yeast product that could function without refrigeration. Compressed yeast deteriorated quickly at room temperature. Military supply chains could not guarantee cold storage across the distances and the conditions of a global war. The result of the development work was granulated active dry yeast, the same Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but dried and granulated rather than compressed, shelf-stable, at room temperature for months rather than days. It could be packed in tins, shipped anywhere, stored without a cold chain, and used when needed. The military application shaped the product, and when the war ended, the product came home. Granulated active dry yeast appeared on grocery store shelves across North America through the late 1940s and gradually across Europe over the following decades. Home bakers, who had previously required either a living starter or a fresh compressed yeast, obtained from a bakery, neither of which kept conveniently in an ordinary kitchen, now had access to a shelf-stable leavening agent that could sit in the cupboard until it was needed. Bread making at home became, in this specific and practical way, more accessible than it had been at any point in the previous century. By 1973, the development had gone a step further. Instant yeast, a finer milled granulate that required no proofing, no preliminary dissolution in warm water, no checking that it was still active, could be mixed directly into the dry flour before the water was added, from the paper packet to the dough in a single step, with no waiting. The Chorleywood bread process, developed in 1961 at the British Baking Industries Research Association in Chorleywood, Hertfordshire, completed the transformation of leavening from a biological culture maintained over time into a precisely controlled industrial parameter. The process was developed by Bill Collins, George Elton, and Norman Chamberlain, working on a practical problem with the British flour supply. British wheat had a lower protein content than the hard North American wheats that produced the strongest, most elastic gluten, the protein network that holds a bread dough together and allows it to trap and retain the gas produced during fermentation. Lower protein flour made weaker dough. Weaker dough produced a less reliable rise and a crumb that was denser and less consistent than the commercial standard required. British bread making had, for much of the preceding century, depended on blending imported high-protein wheat with domestic lower-protein wheat to produce a flour strong enough for good bread. This was an expensive dependency. The Chorleywood process replaced the long fermentation time that had previously been needed to develop the dough's structure with 3 to 4 minutes of high-speed mechanical mixing. Intensive mixing at controlled speed under controlled atmospheric pressure developed the gluten network far more quickly than fermentation alone could manage. Ascorbic acid was added to strengthen the gluten further. A small percentage of fat was added to extend the shelf life of the finished loaf. Elevated quantities of commercial yeast drove a rapid rise once the mixing was complete. From flour to finished, sliced packaged loaf in approximately 3.5 hours. By the first decade of the 21st century, roughly 80% of all bread manufactured in the United Kingdom used this process, or one closely derived from it. It produced the bread that most of the British population had grown up eating, soft, pale, consistent, with an even and tender crumb, and a shelf life of several days. It made British wheat usable. It made bread cheap. These were real achievements, and they fed real households. What the process could not give was time, the long, slow fermentation that had preceded it, hours in a cool room, the dough developing its flavor and its character in the unhurried way that biological processes work, was exactly what the process was designed to replace. The trade was straightforward, speed and cost on one side, fermentation time on the other. Whether it was the right trade is not something this story needs to adjudicate. It was the trade that was made, and most of the bread eaten in Britain for the following half-century was the result of it. There is a quieter story running alongside the industrial history of bread in the 20th century, concerning what happened to the hierarchy of the loaf while it was being standardized and cheapened and made available to everyone. For most of the history covered in this episode, white bread was the bread of the wealthy, the fine, pale manchet of the Tudor table. The twice-bolted flour that represented real labor and real yield loss for every bushel it was milled from. White bread cost more because it required more to produce. Its whiteness was visible evidence of the resources and the refinement of the household that ate it. The bread of ordinary working people was darker, denser, mixed grain or rye. Not inferior in nutrition, not less sustaining, but lower in the hierarchy that bread had always maintained. By the 1970s and 1980s in Britain, white sliced bread was the cheapest loaf on the supermarket shelf. The bread that had been the visible luxury of the gentry for centuries was now the everyday staple of working households who had never given the color of their flour a second thought. Meanwhile, the whole grain bread that had been the bread of the medieval poor, the dark, dense rye loaves, the coarse maslin bread of the village kitchen, had become the premium option, more expensive, sold in smaller quantities, purchased as a deliberate choice rather than as the only affordable thing available. The social meaning of bread had quietly inverted over the course of roughly a century without anyone arranging it or declaring it. The loaf that once signaled wealth now signaled ordinariness. The loaf that once signaled poverty now signaled a particular kind of care and preference. The bread had not changed its nature. What had changed was the world around it, and the meanings the world had decided to attach. Bread had never stopped changing, and for a thread of bakers, not many at first, in small bakeries that kept their own cultures and fermented their doughs over long, unhurried hours, there was something in the older method that seemed worth returning to. The last part of this story follows that thread and finds it spreading in a direction no one had particularly anticipated. In the spring of 2020, a great many people found themselves at home, with time on their hands and flour in the cupboard, and something very old happened again. The gesture was not new, someone tipping flour into a bowl, adding a small amount of water, mixing the two together into a rough paste, covering the bowl with a cloth, and setting it somewhere warm. This was not a new gesture. It had been made in kitchens and beside hearthstones for thousands of years, in the same basic order, with the same basic materials. What was new was only the scale of it, and the simultaneity, many hundreds of thousands of people in different countries doing the same thing at nearly the same time, many of them for the first time in their lives, guided by online communities that had been quietly maintaining this knowledge for years before anyone outside them needed it. The sourdough starter that appeared on those kitchen counters in 2020 was not an invention of 2020. It was a survival. It had been there all along, in the bakeries and the households where it was maintained, in the countries and the traditions where the bread it produced had never been replaced by anything else. The pandemic did not create it. It only caused a very large number of people to discover it at once. While most of the Western world moved toward commercial yeast after 1879, sourdough had never actually left. The reason was not sentiment. The reason was rye. Rye flour behaves differently from wheat flour under the conditions of bread making. It contains high levels of an enzyme called amylase, an enzyme that breaks down the starches in the dough as it is mixed and as it heats toward baking temperature, preventing the crumb from setting correctly and producing, in a loaf without sufficient acidity to counteract it, a dense and gummy interior that does not hold its structure. Sourdough is the solution. The lactic acid produced by the bacteria in a sourdough fermentation inhibits the amylase at baking temperatures, allowing the starch structure to set as it should and the crumb to form correctly. Rye bread made without a sourdough culture is a different and lesser thing. It does not keep, and it does not slice cleanly, and it does not sustain a household through a winter in the way that rye bread is supposed to. Germany and much of Central and Northern Europe had built their bread traditions on rye, not by preference alone, but by climate and geography, because rye grows in soils and conditions where wheat struggles. The long-keeping loaves of the German and Scandinavian bakery, the dense and flavorful breads that are some of the oldest continuous bread traditions in the world, required the sourdough culture to be made correctly. Commercial yeast could not replace it. The culture survived because the bread demanded it, and because the people who ate rye bread had been eating it for too long to stop. The sourdough that survived the industrial era carried its own character, shaped by the places where it lived. In San Francisco, it acquired a character famous enough to be named and sought out. The French bakers who came to California during the gold rush of 1849 brought their sourdough cultures with them. The same basic thing, flour and water and wild yeast, that had leavened French bread for generations. But the cult culture that grew from the San Francisco environment was not quite the same as what they had carried across the country. The particular strains of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria that colonized and came to dominate the starters in that climate produced a bread with a more pronounced acidity than most European sourdoughs, sharper and cleaner, with a crust that behaved differently, that opened along score lines in a particular way. By the 20th century, San Francisco sourdough had its own identity as a regional bread, distinct enough that attempts to replicate it elsewhere, taking a starter sample to another city, maintaining it with local water and local flour, produced a different bread over time. The culture adapted to its new environment. The local air brought different wild yeasts. The local water changed the chemistry of the fermentation. Place made the bread, as long as the culture was fed, in the same way that place makes the wine of a region distinct from the same grape grown somewhere else. Something in the environment left a mark that was real and lasting. The gold rush connection runs in another direction as well, 49 years later and 3,000 miles to the north. During the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898, prospectors made their way into the Yukon in considerable numbers, and among the things they carried were their sourdough starters. In the conditions of the northern winter, temperatures that dropped far below what any kitchen would be allowed to reach, cold that could freeze a pack solid overnight, a starter left unattended would die. So some prospectors carried their cultures warm against their bodies, under the outer layers of clothing, close enough to the skin that the warmth of the body maintained what the ambient temperature would have destroyed. The sourdough starter in this account was not a kitchen accessory. It was something treated with the seriousness of any essential: food, fuel, the tools for making fire. It was kept alive because bread depended on it, and bread was among the things that kept a person alive in those conditions. The culture might be several years old, fed through many previous winters, passed from one pair of hands to another. Its continuity was maintained by the person carrying it, because the person carrying it understood that continuity mattered. In the Yukon, sawdowwow became a word for a person, a veteran prospector, someone who had survived a full winter in the north and come out the other side, someone who had lasted, and who had earned the acknowledgement of lasting. To be called a sourdough was to be named for the thing you had managed to keep alive through conditions that would have ended a less experienced person's time in the territory. Starter and the survivor had borrowed each other's name, and both meant something about endurance. The thread of sourdough that had persisted through the industrial era began, in Britain in the 1980s, to be followed more deliberately by a small number of bakers. These were not bakers working in reaction to the Chorleywood process or in organized opposition to the industrial bakery. They were bakers who had come to a considered preference for a particular kind of bread. Bread given long fermentation time, bread whose flavor developed over many hours rather than being fixed in 3 minutes of intensive mixing. Long fermentation changed the bread in ways that mattered to them. The crumb developed a different texture. The crust behaved differently. The flavor had more layers to it, more depth, more of the character that living organisms produce when they are given time to work. The movement was quiet and small at the beginning. A few bakeries in London, a few more in other cities over the following years, working at a scale that was not industrial, with processes that were slow and therefore inherently limited in what they could produce in a day. The word artisan began to be used, and then used so widely that it eventually lost the precision it had when it was new. But underneath the word, the practice was real. Bread made with a living culture, fermented slowly, shaped by hand, baked in small quantities, a quiet countercurrent running alongside the 80%. In 2020, that small countercurrent met a very large and sudden surge of new interest, and the meeting was not always smooth. Commercial yeast sold out across European supermarkets within weeks of the lockdowns beginning. It returned slowly, in limited quantities, rationed in some shops. While it was absent, the alternative was the method that had existed before commercial yeast did: flour, water, time, and a warm place to wait. The starter-sharing communities that had been maintaining this knowledge online for years found themselves hosting millions of new participants, almost overnight. People who had never baked before were asking basic questions and receiving patient answers. Bags of starter were left on doorsteps for neighbors. Recipes for feeding and maintaining a culture spread through networks built for other purposes. It was, in its small way, a collective rediscovery of something that had been there all along. The bread that came from those pandemic kitchens was, in the real sense, sourdough bread, leavened by a living culture, fermented over time, tasting of that fermentation. Not always good bread, because a starter takes some weeks to develop full strength, and first attempts are often flat or dense, but genuine in its method, honest in what it was trying to be. On the shelf of the same supermarket where the sourdough baking books sold out in that same period, loaves labeled as sourdough sat beside each other, and not all of them were sourdough in the same sense. Sourdough is unregulated as a label in most markets. A loaf sold as sourdough may contain a living fermented culture given real fermentation time, producing the acids and the flavor compounds that define the bread. It may also contain flavoring acids, added to approximate the sourness of genuine fermentation without requiring the living culture or the time. The sourness is there, the bread is there, the culture is not. Under current labeling rules in most jurisdictions, both can carry the same name. The gap between label and reality is not new. Frederick Accum identified it 200 years ago in the white bread on the counter of a London bakery. The bread that looked like well-made bread, cost what bread cost, and contained alum in the flour. The parallel is not exact, and the stakes are lower, but the shape of the problem is the same one. A word that means one thing, applied to a product that is something else. The bread on the counter presenting itself as what the buyer thinks they are buying, and not quite being that thing. What sourdough is, in the context of everything this episode has covered, is continuity, not a return to the past. The person maintaining a sourdough starter in a modern kitchen is not replicating the practice of a baker in medieval Germany, or a prospector in the Yukon, or a woman in ancient Egypt, mixing fermented grain liquid into a new batch of dough. The tools are different, the kitchen is different, the flour is different. The understanding of what is happening inside the culture is entirely different from anything any of those earlier people possessed. But the gesture is the same: flour and water mixed together, time, warmth, feeding the culture so it does not die, using some of it to leaven the bread, returning some of it to the crock. The same act, the same sequence, the same basic requirement, that someone continue doing it regularly without stopping. A sourdough culture survives entirely by being tended. It requires nothing complicated to sustain, but it will not survive being forgotten. It carries, in its invisible biology, the accumulated result of every feeding it has been given and every environment it has inhabited. It is the oldest continuous food technology in ordinary domestic use, and its survival is entirely the result of people deciding, again and again, that it was worth continuing. There is something in the ordinary words for bread, and for the people associated with it, that belongs at the end of this long story. Not as a footnote, but as something to settle with, unhurriedly, in the way that the deepest things in a long history are best settled with. The English word lord comes from the Old English hlaford. The word is a compound, hlaf meaning loaf or bread, and weird meaning keeper or guardian. Hlaford, the loafward, the keeper of the bread, the person responsible for ensuring that those who depended on them were fed. Power, in the language of the people who built the word, was named for the act of feeding. The lord was not the person who commanded, the lord was the person who kept the loaf. The English word lady comes from the Old English hlæfdige, also a compound, hlaf again, bread, and the root dij, related to the verb meaning to knead, the same root that gives the word dough its sound and its origin. Hlæfdige, the bread-kneader, the one whose hands worked the dough. The mistress of the household was named for the act of making bread, not for owning the household, or managing it in some abstract sense, for the specific physical act of her hands in the dough. The word companion comes from the Latin words com and panis, with, and bread. A companion is one who shares bread, not merely a friend, not merely an associate, but someone defined by the shared act of eating from the same loaf, the person you sat down with, the person you were fed beside. These are not curiosities. They are not the interesting margins of the story. They are the record of what the people who lived inside this history thought was worth naming. Power was bread-keeping. Care was bread-kneading. Belonging was bread-sharing. These were not metaphors arrived at later, after the fact. They were the original meanings, built into the words at the moment the words were made, before the words drifted far enough from the grain they grew. From that the connection became invisible. The loaf on the counter, still warm from the oven, flour on the hands of whoever made it. Somewhere in the Jordan desert, 14,000 years ago, hands pale with flour, a flat stone hot beside a fire, an oven warming before dawn on a Roman street, a covered crock of dough rising overnight in a farmhouse kitchen, to be shaped in the morning. The same act, the same patience. A fire and warm stone and the smell of something